Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome to the Irish-Hellenic Society. This is our second meeting since Zoomification, and I hope you're hearing loud and clear. Let me just explain that at the end of our presentation, you'll be able to ask questions using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You may need to touch your screen if you're using a smartphone. And there's a little button called Q&A. And if you have questions to pose through the chair, through me, to Margaret Desmond, I'll try and do so. Margaret will be talking about ancient Rome reimagined as a fire regime. And you may be wondering, number one, what are we doing in the middle of a pandemic talking about fires in ancient Rome? A very good question. We thought we'd do this as a little bit of light relief. And the second thing is, what are we discussing this for in the Irish-Hellenic Society? Surely the Irish-Hellenic Society should be dealing with places like Greece and Cyprus and things like that. Well, of course, you've got to remember that Greece, ancient Greece, and Cyprus for that matter, were ruled from Rome for hundreds and hundreds of years, from about 146 BC and thereon, and Rome was the capital until matters in Greece and Cyprus were ruled from the city of Byzantium, which became Constantinople. So Rome was very much part of the Hellenic world. There was a huge population of Greek speakers in Rome, and among the upper echelons in Roman society, Greek was the language which was spoken. And in fact, one of the major source for a lot of the fires that Margaret is going to be talking about were written about by a man called Cassius Dio, who wrote in Greek. So there are no excuses for talking about ancient Rome in the Irish-Hellenic Society. Our speaker, Margaret Desmond, is from Cork, and she studied in UCC, English and Latin, and she has taught in Brussels, coming there via Ethiopia, and subsequently came back to Dublin and worked in the Department of Education as Inspector for Classics, and then subsequently in what became the State Examinations Commission, before doing an MPhil in Trinity, and then subsequently a PhD under Dr. Hazel Dodge, who was a great authority on everything to do with the ancient city of Rome. Please, Margaret, we'd love to hear what you have to say about ancient Rome reimagined as a fire regime.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the Irish-Hellenic Society, and especially Paddy, for the invitation to talk to you about the fires of Rome. And I'd also like to thank Theo in the background there for all his help in making this technically possible. When I first accepted the invitation to speak on the fires of Rome, little did we think we would be sitting by our own fires at home and dreaming about the time when we can travel to Rome and Athens again. And during the course of this talk, I will refer to specific buildings in Rome, and we can dream about going there again very, very soon. The popular view of ancient Rome is of a combustible, a flammable city. There is a belief that Rome was a tinderbox. I'm just pressing a few buttons here. There's a belief that Rome was a tinderbox ready to burn at any moment. A cramped, jerry-built city with a vast population and teeming with naked flames. Although this view is exaggerated by the manner in which the Great Fire of AD 64, especially, is embedded in historic reception, it is in fact a pretty accurate view. However, there is another side to the story. Rome was also a city where fire was managed on a daily basis. In most pre-industrial cities, fires, ranging from small domestic events to conflagrations, were a central fact of urban life. Large settlements were habitats of fire. In contemporary cities, where flame has largely been eliminated, fire protection saturates the streetscape and individual buildings. And if we were in the Arts Club now, tonight, we'd be able to see fire extinguishers, exit signs, and so on. In fact, the modern city is now seen as a fire-driven ecosystem, best described as a fire regime. Greg Bancroft's definition of this modern concept can, in my view, just as easily be applied to Rome. So what is a fire regime? The systems of building and managing cities that developed in relation to specific patterns of fire engendered by local and environmental conditions. I would argue that of all ancient cities, Rome fits the bill as a fire regime. It had all the conditions we're familiar with in our knowledge of ancient cities and settlements, but Rome was different, in fact, unique in terms of scale. So if we look at some of the elements in the building and managing of Rome, we can see how they relate directly to fire management, while the local and environmental conditions certainly engendered fire hazards. These elements on the slide that you can now see show an acute awareness of the dangers of fire and the need to prevent them. In other words, how to manage fire. So under building and managing ancient Rome in relation to fire, we have, first of all, technology and building materials. This theme is worthy of at least one talk of its own, but I intend to weave some aspects of the Romans' mastery of building technology into my later comments. The next one, building design. We tend to think of Rome, apart from the major well-known monumental and public spaces, as largely without serious urban design. In other words, a city that grew like Topsy, it growed in a haphazard way, sometimes with almost frantic haste to accommodate waves of new arrivals needing a roof over their heads. And again, there is truth in that description. But if we look at the next one, legislation, a clear awareness of fire risk and fire prevention is apparent. Legislation is very telling in the management of fire and the risk of fire in the ancient city. From the time of the 12 tables devised according to Livy in 451 BC, there seems to have been laws governing arson. In fact, fire setting continued to be covered in criminal law legislation for centuries thereafter. However, it is in building regulations that we see a definite preoccupation with fire prevention. We have evidence that the 12 tables provided for a space between adjacent buildings. But with that began a familiar pattern, the flouting of regulations, and we're all familiar with that. Time and again, laws governing the height, ambit, material and design of residential buildings were passed only to be renewed years later by another leader or emperor, because they'd obviously fallen into neglect. For example, Augustus put a limit of 70 Roman feet on new buildings, but the back alleys probably remained unchanged. Trajan later reduced the limit to 60 feet, so there must have been a problem. The most comprehensive building laws were those passed by Nero after the Great Fire of Rome in 64. The much maligned Nero. And I have to confess, I have a soft spot for Nero. I'm probably one of the only people who has that soft spot. Anyway, the much maligned Nero produced a list of measures. Minimum spaces between buildings were required, shared walls were banned, and heights restricted. Stone rather than wood was to be used in construction where possible. Internal courtyards and porticos to protect against falling debris were to be built. He also legislated for the widening of streets. One of the complaints against him was that the widened streets exposed the citizens to the heat of the sun. But it can be seen, obviously, that all of this squeezed the population into a smaller footprint of living space. The next one I have on the slide here are the Vigiles, the fire brigade. I'll come back to them. If we just look at the local and environmental conditions, earthquake and floods. The 7 hills of Rome, the romantic hills of Rome, owe their existence to volcanic activity, and the city is flanked by large, geologically young volcanic fields. Quakes and tremors were familiar events in Rome. Floods also, a frequent occurrence, and another urban ill with which the Romans were familiar. And together, earthquakes and floods weakened the foundations of buildings. They led to collapsing buildings, and because of the abundance of naked flame within the buildings, fires broke out. In fact, references to the twin problems of ruina, meaning collapse of buildings, and incendia, fire, frequently figure in the sources. This shows the importance of recognizing how urban ills cannot always be treated in isolation. Naked flame. We have naked flame in topography, but I just want to have a look at some of the things that were the sources of naked flame in Rome, in the household and in other contexts. Naked flame abounded in the city in a commercial, residential, and ritual context. By the way, in the ritual context, it must be noted that the Temple of Vesta burned on a number of occasions. Fire was, of course, life-giving. It's a human characteristic to manipulate fire, to use it for survival while actively trying to control and avoid it. The Romans were masters of this. On the slide, this slide that I'm showing you, apart from the two furnaces, everything else is portable and can easily be knocked over. Just imagine portable braziers in cramped living quarters with another ingredient, dogs and children. I came across an intriguing statistic for the US. Almost 7% of those arrested for arson in 1994 were children under the age of 10. And drilling into that statistic, I found that they were usually boys between the ages of 3 and 10. I can't imagine that Roman children were any less fascinated or curious about fire. Moved ahead to quickly there. Topography and population is the next element of the fire regime. The natural topography of Rome, with its valleys, its hills and marshes, dictated the settlement pattern of the city. There were only so many areas which lent themselves naturally to habitation, and from the earliest times, people tended to cluster in those areas. The scale on Claridge's map there illustrates the limited size of the area of the city. But the factor which differentiates Rome from any other ancient, and in fact any other pre-industrial city, was the size of the population. This is a contested topic. How do you count? How do you know? There are ways. It is contested, but the estimate accepted by modern scholars is around 800,000 to 1 million at the time of Augustus, all living in a relatively limited space. The increase in population from the earliest times was characterized not by steady growth, but by sudden spurts of immigration in the wake of successful Roman military campaigns. Therefore, there were periods of urgent building programs to house newcomers to the city. And this also, of course, presented lucrative opportunities to make money if one were a developer or a landlord. And in these circumstances, it made sense that anyone owning land in Rome would wish to build upwards to maximize the potential of the site. The fragment on the right of your slide is from the Forma Orbis Romae, also called the Marble Plan. It was a massive map of ancient Rome created by Septimius Severus around AD 205, and it was originally fixed to the wall of the Temple of Peace, Templum Pacis. This particular slab, fragment 10, shows the Subura, and I'll talk about the Subura later. The Subura with its alleys, shop fronts, and insulae, in other words, the apartment blocks, in a dense conglomeration of residential and commercial activity. What the Marble Plan does not show are the steep slopes of the city. this particular slide shows 3 further fragments of the forma of the marble plan, and they show the confined, narrow, and we know steep terrain with its mix of residential units, shops, and factories, all teeming with naked flame. These are the classic ingredients for a firestorm should a serious fire break out. I think it's worth looking at Tacitus's description of the fire of AD 64. Although written some 60 years after the fire, it is actually the first historical report of the behaviour of fire in an urban context. And I'll read this because it is worth looking at. Once the fire had caught, it grew stronger and faster due to the wind. That wind is a self-generating wind in a fire. With increasing force, it moved first along the lowland, it then moved uphill, only to descend again and destroy the low areas. Any attempt to stop the fire was overwhelmed by the speed of the conflagration and by the vulnerability of the city due to its narrow, winding streets. It moved hither and thither in the huddled, labyrinthine districts of which old Rome comprised. Indeed, old Rome comprised of that. But Rome continued to comprise of labyrinthine districts. The accuracy of the description, and of course it's much longer than this short excerpt, is borne out by both modern fire science and by eyewitness accounts of other fires, such as that in Lisbon in 1755, a city of similar topography to Rome. The fire and the earthquake in Lisbon is actually very dear to my heart, because I am at the moment in lockdown in Rosscarbery, County Cork, and I go to the beach every day, and the beach was created by the tsunami in 1755, in turn created by the earthquake of Lisbon. So I give thanks, which is rather perhaps a harsh thing to do, but I give thanks for the earthquake in Lisbon every day. Now, I'm going to take just 2 examples of typical Roman structures which show conscious and deliberate fire management. By the end of the 4th century AD, Rome had 856 balnea, or baths. We know this from the regionary catalogues. We have lists of what existed. The amount of brush and wood needed for all of the baths was enormous, and it must have been stored all over the city. For example, modern experiments have estimated that the baths of Caracalla, built at the beginning of the 3rd century, needed 85 kilograms of wood for initial heating and 18 kilograms per hour to maintain. The furnaces of over 800 baths, obviously all of different sizes, and we do have the remains of one which existed under a domus right in the middle of the residential quarters of Rome. But the furnaces of over 800 baths would have to be carefully managed and monitored, as would the numerous storage facilities. We tend to forget about that. Now, on the right-hand side of your picture, the aurea, or the granaries of Rome, were very important buildings indeed. The vast population had to be fed. In 193 BC, the colossal Porticus Aemilia became the prototype for the great mercantile warehouses, which grew more numerous in the later Republic to house the enormous quantities of now largely imported grain. And you can see I have delineated that. You can see the size of the Porticus Aemilia, absolutely enormous. Now, an appreciation of their inherent fire risk is apparent in the design of the aurea, such as the Porticus Aemilia, and in their construction. And they illustrate vividly the city's management of fire prevention. The temperatures inside the granaries were carefully controlled to prevent spontaneous combustion from a chemical process within the mass of grain. underfloor ventilation, walls of striking thickness and solidity, originally built of great tufa stone blocks, and from the 1st century AD on, built at least in part by brick-faced concrete. Carefully positioned doors and windows, all managed temperature and humidity. As the Romans knew, if fire did break out, the warehouses burned fiercely and food shortages had potentially catastrophic human and political consequences. The choice, oh, by the way, this is one of the structures that we can see as soon as we're released and we can go to Rome again. The choice and use of stone for building played a very important role in fire and flood and quake management. The Romans used local stone from the earliest times, and the choice of stone, always volcanic tufa from different nearby regions, changed at intervals over the centuries. At the beginning of the imperial period, a stone called peperino tufa was quarried from Alba Longa, only 24 kilometers from Rome, and it was widely used in the 1st century, a period of unprecedented building. Now, this stone had significant fire-resistant properties, and it was combined with the gabine tufa, which, although softer, also had fire-resistant properties in the towering firewall of the Forum of Augustus. And there you have it. This wall rose to nearly 36 meters and survives almost to full height. So it's there. We can go up behind it there on that little road and touch it. It's a perfect example of the interface of fire prevention, innovation, and ideology. Constructed at the back of the Forum of Augustus, and you can see the drawing there, and I've ringed the wall. Constructed at the back of the Forum of Augustus, it served the double purpose of protection against the spread of fire from the more fire-prone commercial and domestic quarters of the Subura, again, while also shutting off the view of that part of the city. It may actually also have saved the Forum of Augustus from devastation in the fire of 64. Now, why would one want to shut off the view of the Subura? Well, the Subura was one of the most populous and active districts of Rome. Noisy, dirty, wet, with markets, street food, artisan workshops, blacksmiths, cobblers, bakers, metalworkers, tanners, and of course, brothels. Now, I've already spoken of building regulations, and I've touched upon building materials, and I've pointed out that the Romans were acutely conscious of the need to manage fire, but regulations were constantly flouted, and 1 million people simply had to live somewhere. The reiteration over time of legislation curtailing the height of the insulae, the apartment blocks, indicates that this was a recurring problem. Augustus had put a limit of 70 Roman feet on the height of new buildings erected on public streets, allowing 10 Roman feet per story means that buildings were officially capped at 6 or 7 stories. But they must have risen dangerously higher. There were always ways of getting around the law. One could build higher further back from the street line, where it couldn't be seen, and lighter wooden structures made in Opus Craticium probably topped many an insula. Now, Opus Craticium, that you can see in both of these slides, was a timber framework filled with rubble and mortar. In fact, originally insulae were probably made entirely of Opus Craticium because it was cheap and light, and ironically, easy to replace if it burned down. But the Romans were well aware of the fire risk in this material. Vitruvius, for example, bemoaned its very existence, as walls made of it were, according to him, torches ready for kindling. And to add insult to possible injury, resourceful landlords and builders almost doubled their floor space between ground and top stories by projecting each additional story out over the one below. And that's known as jettying. And you can see that on the right-hand side. And this example here is from Herculaneum. It's again something you'll see in many medieval cities. It was something very common in London around the time of the Great Fire, before the time of the Great Fire. In the context of a quickly growing population, the expansion of the building trade from the 2nd century BC and the requirement for faster building techniques and materials, considerations of fire prevention must have formed part of the revolutionary changes in both faster production techniques and the choice of materials such as stone, concrete, and fired brick. Opus cementicum, or mortar, cement, had long been used by the Romans as a bonding agent, but it became all important in the building programs of the 1st century, especially after the Fire of 64. Not because of the fire resistance of concrete itself. In fact, it can crumble and become quite a danger in fire. Not because of concrete itself, but because concrete gave a smooth, stable surface that could be faced with fired brick. The result was about as fire resistant as one could get. And it's what we see today in the surviving structures of, for example, Trajan's markets, which we will go to visit again soon. Fire prevention or retardation was not the only impetus for this innovation in building techniques, because the fired bricks actually lent themselves to speedy mass production without the need for specialized skills. But fire prevention was definitely a factor in this revolutionary development, and revolutionary development it was. Now, Ostia, and you may all be familiar with this, this structure. Ostia is frequently cited as a well-planned, an ideal of urban planning with well-built brick-faced insulae, such as what we see here, the so-called House of Diana. Now, it was long assumed that such buildings could not have existed in Rome, but the possibility that some of the insulae in Rome were at least partly built as robustly as the so-called House of Diana must be considered. For example, on the western slope of the Capitoline, and next to the steps leading to the church of Santa Maria in Ara Coeli, you will see this. It's very easy to miss because it's very dull and it's not in great condition, to say the least of it. It's very easy to miss. It has a small neglected sign in front of it, and it is also fronted by currently defaced perspex, a lot of graffiti on it and so on. But to me, it's one of the most fascinating ruins in Rome. It is the insula Ara Coeli, built of concrete faced with fired brick. We have no idea how many stories there were, because it was built against the hill. It would certainly have supported 5 or 6 at least. The next slide shows the depth on the left-hand side. You can see that the depth of about 10 meters below the current street level. And that would have been the original street level. And on the ground floor, there are workshops with living quarters at mezzanine level. And note the colonnades. I'll come back to that later. This is maybe what Nero legislated for in his renewal of the city, shall we say, after the Fire of 64. Maybe that. On the right-hand side, you can see the 3rd floor of the insula Ara Coeli. That's a photograph I took. They're both photographs I took myself a couple of years ago. I had to get special permission to go into this building. It's not safe. It's as simple as that, really. And it is greatly neglected, but as I say, one of the great wonders of Rome, I think. Now, and I said I'd come back to these chaps. One cannot talk of the concept of Rome as a fire regime without mentioning the Vigiles, the fire brigade, we'll call them, freeze. But it must be said that any study of the Vigiles is hampered by the modern concept of a fire brigade. Although more has been written about the Vigiles than any other aspect of fire management in Rome, there has been a consistent lack of consensus about everything from their number, their policing role, their quarters, their methods of fighting fire. The force was formally instituted by Augustus in AD 6, interestingly made up of freedmen, previous manumitted slaves. And it was instituted along paramilitary lines, and then it evolved over the centuries. Bizarrely, they're rarely mentioned in historical accounts of fires, and never in the context of extinguishing a fire. But by the time of Severus in AD 205, they constituted a force of about 7,000 patrolling armed men as part and parcel of the days and especially the nights of the city. However, we do know that they worked in shifts, so maybe 1/3 at a time. On your slide, you can see the entrance that can be seen today, leading to the excubatorium, and then you can see down on the right-hand side the excubatorium, which is the firehouse, if you like, would be the best way of putting it, of the of this branch of the Vigiles. And in the middle, graffiti. I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Now, if the Vigiles were regarded purely as a fire service, they're still the largest relative to the ground area of all time. It's likely that they had policing duties, and we know that they had the right to use their axes to enter private property. Petronius refers to them in the Cana Trimalchionis. They're afraid they're going to come and disrupt festivities by knocking down the door if they smell smoke. Seneca also refers to them as knocking down doors, smelling smoke. But they also had political clout, these Vigiles. For example, they surrounded the Senate during the fall of Sejanus in opposition to the Praetorian Guard. They were instrumental in the accession of Claudius. They supported Vespasian against the Vitellians in AD 69, and they supported Severus in AD 193. And they received his favor, and perhaps that was the reason why they doubled in numbers by Severus. What you can see today, as I said, we have the excubatorium of the 7th cohort, which was in what we now know as Trastevere, which was region 14 of Augustus's 14 regions of Rome. Now, you can visit the cafe. There's a cafe next to it. You can visit the cafe, and it's cafe/bar. You can have a coffee there or a little drink, but you cannot go into the excubatorium itself, the fire station itself. Special permission is required to visit it. And when I visited it about 3 years ago, it really was in a dreadful state. It is crumbling. It's in danger of falling apart. And it is one of the most fascinating places in Rome. So what a pity. I think it's a matter of money. By the way, 97 graffiti, individual pieces of graffiti, were found there in 1886. They were luckily transcribed, as they've now all disappeared. And what we have here is one of them. There was a lot of complaining on in the graffiti And people saying, "I wish my shift was over. You know, I'm fed up of making making torches." Torches, interesting. Now, the Vigiles. Sorry, I've just jumped ahead a little too soon. Vigiles used buckets made of rope treated with pitch, and they presumably worked in a bucket chain. And they had the pejorative nickname sparteoli, little brooms or little pieces of broom, which is interesting. They didn't seem to command such great respect amongst the population. In reality, once fire took hold, water would not work, and the bucket chain would have been pointless. Only demolition of buildings to create a firebreak could stop the progress of fire, and the Vigiles had the ballistae and so on. They had the materials to do that, fire breaks. And that actually, believe it or not, remained the situation in firefighting until a man called Jan van der Heyden invented a fire engine in Amsterdam in around 1700. The Romans were not bettered in that period. Now, in the final part of my talk, I'd like to look at fire as opportunity, and especially at the most spectacular fire, which transformed the fabric and the shape of ancient Rome more than any other. This slide, and on the left you can see, shows the extent of the fire as recorded by the sources. We have red areas, regions 3, 4, and 10. Were they destroyed? ? And the other ones in pink were damaged ? Modern research and excavations indicate that the extent of the fire was exaggerated by our sources, but there is no doubt that it was a catastrophic fire that razed large sections of the city. What the fire generated was the most spectacular example of a building program associated with self-advertising by Nero. He embarked on a deliberate and comprehensive plan to transform and improve the city. It was arguably the greatest single attempt to change the city in the aftermath of a fire. Central to his plan was the Domus Aurea, now open to the public, section of it. You have to book your tickets in advance. Can we do that? To the right of your slide, the plan on the right gives you some idea of the extent of this. Central to his plan was the Domus Aurea. Now, this was not a house. This was not just a house. It was an estate based on the concept of rus in urbe, with woodland, pastures, and lakes, all with an elaborate private villa at its heart. Estimates of the size of the site range from 125 to 200 acres, and some regard those estimates as conservative. It's calculated that its grounds took in the Palatine, the Velian, and the Oppian hills, extended far onto the Esquiline, and included the basin framed by the hills, by those hills, where Nero planned a vast lake. Now, if you're wondering where to place this in your mental map of Rome, just look at the lake, the square lake in the middle of the plan, and that is the site of the future Flavian amphitheatre, the Colosseum. So that will place it for you and the extent around it. The Domus was unfinished when Nero was assassinated in 68, and as Vespasian, the first of the Flavians, emerged victorious from the fighting of AD 69, he began to demolish and reconfigure Nero's work. A large-scale damnatio memoriae, the obliteration of his memory. And among the most important change was the development of the Flavian amphitheatre on the site of Nero's lake. Vespasian could still avail of the devastation caused by the fire of 64 and use the sites designated by Nero, while at the same time demolishing Nero's work, in a positive political statement that made the Flavian ideological and architectural mark on the city and on history. The Great Fire, the subsequent Great Fire of AD 80 in the reign of Titus, allowed his brother Domitian, who was the third and last of the Flavians, to embark on yet another vast building program. For example, go to the Piazza Navona in the Campus Martius and enjoy the beauty of his stadium. In that program, Domitian continued to obliterate any traces of Nero's Domus Aurea by using it as foundation for some of his own program. For example, remnants of Neronian work have been found under part of the complex of Domitian's palace, the Domus Flavia, which is on the left of the plan there. The Domus Flavia was probably built on part of the substructures of the Domus Aurea. A consistent message running through the rebuilding programs of the Flavians was that they were distancing themselves from the previous regime and were returning to the people what had been removed by Nero. The canvas upon which they could effect this was provided by two great fires. On the accession of Trajan in 98, the devastation of 64 had not yet been entirely remedied, to say nothing of the fire of 80. And traces of the Oppian wing of the Domus Aurea can be seen in the foundations of the baths. So still there, on the plan, you can see it. It's almost like a palimpsest, where the square structure of Trajan's baths is built over part of the substructure of the Domus Aurea, used as the foundations. And you can see what can be seen today. There's the artist's impression of the Trajan's baths and what remains today. Now, finally, in this list of buildings, Hadrian's Pantheon or Agrippa's. Built by Agrippa in the Principate of Augustus and burned in the fire of AD 80, restored by Domitian as far as we know, and burned again in AD 110, after which it was completely rebuilt by Hadrian, probably on an entirely new plan, and that is what we see today. And we will see it again. I'm showing this mainly because of the inscription, which you probably can't see quite clearly. It's M. Agrippa LF Cos Tertium Fecit, which is Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, 3 times consul, or on the 3rd time of being consul, made this building. Now, in a significant break with tradition, demonstrating his own political ideology, and in a show of respect for his predecessors by firmly establishing a direct connection with Augustus through Agrippa, Trajan did not put his name, I beg your pardon, Hadrian did not put his name on the new structure, but rather that of Agrippa, the original builder. Thus, fire has once again afforded a political and ideological opportunity and has bequeathed us one of the most beautiful and astonishing buildings that we know of. And I'll finish with a bit of fun for us to contemplate how entertaining getting just about everything wrong can be. Hollywood's version of the Fire of Rome, it has to be admitted that Peter Ustinov's part was an absolute tour de force. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for a wonderful talk, based as it is on a wonderful thesis, which, pardon the pun, I flashed through and enjoyed greatly. I'm deeply envious. It was a great piece of work. I congratulate you. We have a question from Stella Xenopoulou, and she's asking if fire could only be stopped by demolition, what then was the role of the Vigiles? What was their work? This is, I know it's a very difficult question to answer, but how did they alert the reserves, and what did they do first of all, or do we have these details? You said there was very little literary evidence for it.
There's very little literary evidence for them actually extinguishing fires. But you see, literary evidence deals with large fires and small fires of perhaps religious or political significance. They don't deal with domestic fires. And so what one has to imagine is that the Vigiles going around and constantly patrolling, smelling for smoke, really, would have been somewhat on hand to help with the outbreak of domestic fires. There was a gentleman called Rainbird, who was an expert on the Vigiles, and he actually estimated by a whole series of mathematical and historical formula that there must have been about 100 fires a day in, for example, in Augustan Rome. So the Vigiles would have been involved in that. But the question is really a very, very interesting one, because it isn't quite clear to what extent they interacted with the other urban cohorts. You see, there were so many other urban cohorts, and there's no doubt but that their role did change over time, and they became a political force. There's no doubt about that. If I were to recommend a book on them, this is the book. It is the most fantastic compendium of every piece of information on the Vigiles. It's written in beautiful French by a man called Robert Sablerolles. So the answer to everything is in there.
We have another question coming in. Is there any, from Derek Bridges, is there any evidence for fire drills in ancient Rome?
Oh, yes. No, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have immediately said yes. There is lots of evidence of fire drills by the Vigiles themselves, but there is no evidence whatsoever of citizens engaging in fire drills. In fact, one of the intriguing things about the design of buildings and of insulae is the haphazard nature of those buildings, and one floor was different to another, and one room led on to another, and so on. There didn't seem to be while the city was extremely conscious of fire, in the building of insulae, there was nothing like the same consciousness that we have today, for instance, of fire escapes. It was not an issue. And fire drills, no, I know nothing. I have not come across the citizenry being asked to engage in fire drills. The only thing is, of course, that, you know, one was never very far from a fountain or a basin of water, because of this another wonderful topic is water management in Rome. But one could go and get a basin of water and fling it on a small fire or whatever. One could do that, but no fire drills.
Can I ask you, Margaret, what initiated you into this idea of doing research on fire? Have you got fire people in your background, in your ancestry, or had you got
Not that I know, not that I know of.
do you carry a certain gene?
Not that I know of, Paddy. No, it was amazing. It was one of those kind of light bulb moments. You see, I had spent all of my life, in the traditional great men and great battles and great writers like Livy and so on. I had been doing that. And when I got the opportunity to go to study the MPhil in Trinity, I discovered that I could take the same evidence and look at it differently. Things had changed from when I was an undergraduate to such an extent, and that taught MPhil was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life, I have to say, in Trinity. It was just a superb program. But to see that it could be multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, and that you could look, as I say, at the same things, and through something like fire, look at the history, the politics, because none of these fires really, can be taken in isolation without looking at the historical and political background and so on. But also to be able to take comparative studies and to look at the lives of the silent silent citizens, because we only, obviously, our sources only tell us about certain echelons in society. So and once I got started, I just couldn't stop. I found it just so interesting.
Yeah. Well, there's also a huge element of continuity in anything to do with fires, and I must say, from listening to you this evening, and from reading your thesis, which is available, by the way, it's on open access in Trinity, and I think people in the invitation will have the link to that. Otherwise, come back to me. It's well worth reading. It's an amazing piece of research, and extremely enjoyable. And as you say, you're looking at things which you had read your Roman history, of men in battles, but this looks at ancient Rome from a totally different perspective, through a different lens, and it is utterly fascinating, and it brings in so many different aspects, from the art and architecture to the numismatics, looking at coins, all kinds of evidence, as well as the textual evidence, both in Latin and in Greek, as I said. From my own experience, it rang. You were saying that you had a special place in your heart for Lisbon and the earthquake of 1755. Well, I have a particular space in my heart for the largest city in the world of Tokyo, and where I lived a quarter of a century ago. And Tokyo had the distinction then of having burnt down twice in the previous 70 years. Once in 1923 on the 1st of September, the Great Kanto earthquake, and every 1st of September ever since, the whole of Japan goes into an earthquake drill day, because in earthquakes, you don't fall down a hole in the ground so much as burn alive. And indeed, while I was in Tokyo, the fourth biggest city in Japan suffered an earthquake, and people died in fires, 12,000 of them, on live television for the following 2 or 3 weeks, from gas fires in that city. So fires are something which is very much in people's minds to this very day. Can I say that there are some Irish connections with fires as well, not always in Ireland. A famous fire, the Great Fire in Chicago in 1875, was supposed to have been started off by a certain Catherine O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern with a live flame, which bears out what you were saying, Margaret, about utensils around the house which are portable or which can be kicked over, very vulnerable. And secondly, then, the huge earthquake and subsequent fires in San Francisco in 1906. But we also had, nearer to home, the Great Fire of Dublin. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this particular fire, but it had its own very Irish and Dublin characteristics, because it was in a whiskey distillery in just off Cork Street in the Liberties, and the result was that huge numbers of barrels of whiskey were burst open in the fire, and their contents flowed down the streets of the Liberties, and the local population woke up and got out and brought any utensils they could, their hats, their boots and shoes, but most of all, their own persons. So there were no people who were burnt to death in this fire, but there were 12 fatalities, which consisted of 12 people who died of alcohol poisoning. And also a dog, which got so drunk from lapping up the whiskey from the street that it wandered all around Dublin, ended up somewhere near Parnell Street, terrifying people, climbed up to the top of the building, and then jumped out the window and killed itself on the ground outside. Such is the way we do things in this country. I'd be glad to tell you about our next meeting through Zoom, of course, which is taking place on the 9th of December. And Michael Barry will be talking to us about something which also had a few fires in it as well, the Irish Revolution. This is it'll be based, of course, on his wonderful 3 books dealing with 1916, with the War of Independence and the Civil War. And it will include such fires as the burning of Cork in December 1920, the anniversary of which is coming up, of course, in next month. But there were also 2 Dublin-based fires which were of immense importance during that period as well. One was the devastating fire of the Custom House, where the Dublin Fire Brigade were involved not so much in putting out the fire as in spreading the fire, because they got access to the building and they made very sure that no fire was put out until the building was completely destroyed, and with it all hope of the British administration being able to function ever again in this country. And subsequently, of course, and very sadly, the destruction with fire also of the 4 courts in Dublin at the beginning of the Civil War. Finally, I'd like to thank our speaker, Margaret Desmond, for a wonderfully interesting paper. And now that you've seen the film, I urge you to read the book. It's a great read, and I think you will find it riveting. And there's, of course, vastly more to be seen in it than she could possibly have talked to us in our talk tonight. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on the 9th of December. Good night now.